Hello, and welcome to Global Data Thematic Intelligence. We track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. My name is Eve Thomas, and this week I'm talking to three experts from Greenpeace, the Climate Group, and Extinction Rebellion to hear more about the UK's green spending strategies. First up, Doug Parr, Director of Policy at Greenpeace, explained where the UK stands in terms of spending on the green transition.
A few weeks ago, we put out some numbers because one of my colleagues, Jack, had done some analysis on what our competitor economies in the EU had been spending on the green transition. And loads of people will tell you this is going to be the biggest growth story of the 21st century, aside from, of course, allowing us to maintain a habitable planet, which is, I think most people would agree, a good thing. And what we found is that over the last 4 years from 2019 to 2023, when you strip out the spend on affordability of energy, in other words, the subsidies that allowed people to keep themselves warm and so on, the spend on energy that was taking us in a green direction was lower than any of these other economies, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And in fact, was substantially lower than Italy and Germany, and even only half that of France. So this is all based on the International Energy Agency numbers. You can extract the spend that they see the different countries spending. The great thing about the IEA, of course, is that the International Energy Agency is that they'll be doing it in a consistent way. So there's no bias this way or that way. They just look at it in the same way. We can see that the UK is substantially lower than our allies, but also competitor economies. So it does suggest that the UK is not really spending what it needs to do on the green transition. We know that those many countries in Europe are also, trying and struggling to some extent to make it all hang together. But we're spending even less than they are, which does not necessarily mean it's a problem today or tomorrow or by the end of the year. But there will come a time, and it won't be that far away, when that lack of spending on infrastructure does become a problem.
Helen Clarkson, CEO of the Climate Group, echoed Parr's concerns, calling for a clearer strategy to decarbonise industries. I asked her whether the UK is spending enough.
So the very short answer to that is no, and it doesn't compare very well. I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I'm starting to think about how we talk about, when we talk about green spending. And I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't even categorise it like that. The UK, along with most other countries in the world now, has a net zero target. Our goal is net zero by 2050. What that means is actually everything that we do, everything that the UK spends money on, we should be thinking about making that expenditure fit for a zero carbon economy. And so it's kind of reorientating, making sure we're not thinking about, okay, there's spending over here and then there's some green spending over here, because actually we should be having an industrial strategy, for example, that understands that we need to decarbonize our industries. If we want to be competitive, we need to be thinking about what other countries are doing. We need to understand renewable energy. So that's my kind of quibble on the term, and I've been thinking a lot about that, and it's not a critique of using that, but it's just how we shift our mindsets, I think, is the really big question. But then if you sort of get into the numbers, you can see like where we're falling short. So if we look at kind of the 5 large Western economies, so France, Germany, Spain, Italy, we're behind all of them on what we spend on green energy. The UK's Committee on Climate Change last week criticised the spending on adaptation and saying that it falls far short of what's required. So across all these different domains, the UK just isn't doing enough and isn't sort of wrapping it all together in kind of holistic public procurement, public spending that understands the economy we're trying to shift to in the next 20 years.
On the 6th of March, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, set out the spring budget. Among other plans, he announced a year-long extension to the windfall tax on oil and gas companies, but he also shared that the government would freeze fuel duty on petrol and diesel for the 14th consecutive year. The budget drew criticism for omitting mention of climate change, including from Extinction Rebellion, whose protest liaison Richard Ecclestone outlined the views of the environmental movement.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we had high expectations, to be fair. I mean, let's remember this was a political budget, wasn't it? It's a last-ditch effort by the incumbent government to try and get some movement in the polls on what we anticipate will be the election this year. So we weren't expecting very much. I mean, politically, we weren't expecting there to be any movement on fuel duty. Again, I hark back to what I said earlier. If we just held our nerve beforehand and recognized that this was potentially a measure that could have helped decarbonize road transport, it hasn't happened, and no government of any stripe has had the courage or the ability to reintroduce it. So yeah, there's that. The windfall tax, I mean, obviously that needs to be there. The energy companies making obscene profits from the consequences of the war in Ukraine. But of course, they've got that get out of jail free card for them, haven't they? With the tax breaks for, I mean, horror of horrors, investing in more production of fossil fuels from the North Sea. This is probably not a technical term, but for us, this is just bonkers. Why would you encourage people to make the problem worse? It does not make any sense.
In response to the budget, Akash Nayak, head of climate justice at Greenpeace UK, said that the Chancellor had botched his last chance to tackle the scale of the climate and economic crises. Parr explained what this meant and what Greenpeace had hoped to see in the budget.
Yeah, I mean, I think hope and expect were a little bit different on this front, but what we'd hoped to see was something to address the real problem that we've got in the UK, which is our poor quality housing. It's going to be a considerable drag, both in terms of social welfare, social justice, and on the green transition, if we can't keep people warm as we move to a different heating system. But even if we continue to use gas, we're using more gas than is necessary just because the quality of our housing is so poor. So that was probably number one. I think we wanted to see a little bit more on actually less money and more coherence of plan behind the delivery of charge points for electric vehicles to make sure that everything was hanging together there. And I think we wanted to see something a bit more on making sure that the spend that will be spent on future renewables would be delivering the sort of outcomes that we need in terms of the scale up that's necessary. Because every wind farm that isn't built is a load of gas that needs to be imported. So the faster we can get onto renewables, then the better. And there are some fairly techie bits around the parameters of the next contract auction that we were hoping to see would be put right, with enough money to make sure that it was done well, but also to get the volume scaled up.
Clarkson outlined where the climate group believes the UK should be prioritising its green investment.
Yeah, so I think there's energy infrastructure would be the main one. When you look at renewable energy, and this is a thing that we've looked at globally, part of the energy transition is just putting in the hardware, the solar power, the offshore wind, onshore wind, all that, getting the actual technologies up. But then there's a lot of work that needs to be done on things like the grid. So that's where we should be spending more money. Understanding the technologies. So a lot of energy efficiency that needs to be done is about the technology and the smart use of energy. So how do you manage energy in order to use less? And the IEA always talks about this, so the International Energy Agency always talks about the cheapest form of energy is the energy you don't use. And part of that commitment last year at the COP was there was a lot of focus on trebling renewable energy, but there's also that doubling of energy efficiency. Now, a lot of that is going to come through technology and the use of AI. So that's something we should be expending more on. And then we've really got to tackle this onshore wind issue. And that's something we would like to see much more from the government on, because that we have lagged behind, and that the public support for onshore wind has really changed in the last few years. I think actually there's a recent poll I think last year that said about 70% of people in the UK are supportive of onshore wind. So there's really no reason in a windy country like the UK that we're not really tackling that investment in wind.
Parr echoed Clarkson's belief in the potential of wind and her calls for investment into infrastructure. He explained where Greenpeace believes the pain points lie and how investment could speed the green transition.
So we've got we're now starting to encounter a problem with our networks, particularly the electricity network. So we do need to have some priority spend on there. That's there's a lot on transmission. In other words, where are we going to generate our electricity in the future? We're going to be generating it offshore in the North Sea and in Scotland, where the wind resource is so much higher than it is in England. You know, and just to explain that a little more, the amount of energy and electricity that is captured by a wind turbine goes up with the cube of the speed of the wind. So if you've got an average wind speed about half of what it is in Scotland, as is quite common actually for a decent site in Scotland compared to a kind of home county site, then you will be getting 8 times the electricity if you put the equivalent turbine on a hill in Scotland compared to a Shire County location. So, you know, we've got to bring the power down from where it's going to be generated. We've got a huge resource in the UK, across the UK, which we can actually use to export as well, because I think, you know, our continental neighbours are going to be very happy to be getting energy from us rather than from, as I say, importing it in the form of LNG and so on. So we have this opportunity, but we need to be able to connect those wind farms. Those wind farms are potentially going to be profitable. There'll be contracts from government which will be cheaper, particularly for onshore wind. They'll likely be cheaper than the average price of electricity. But we've got to be able to get it down to where the users are. And we're well behind with that. We're well behind with that, and there's some measures that are now being taken that are sort of slowly getting us up to speed. But suddenly we're going to need an awful lot of kit. We're going to need cables. We're going to need skilled technicians to install them. We're going to need substations, transformers. You know, all this stuff is going to have to be built. There's going to have to be built quite a lot of it and at speed. So interventions by government to help support that in terms of not just the money, because actually the money would be put up by private individuals on the back of the existing regulatory system that we have. But we do need clarity. We need a planning system where you can get certainty, early certainty of outcome about route. We need government to step in to support supply chain expansion at speed. Otherwise, we're going to be competing with every other nation in Europe for cabling and forcing up the price, and which ultimately consumers will pay. So that's just one example of where it's not just the money, although money is helpful. It's actually government help and support to make it happen that we're really after. As well as what I said, where we were a bit disappointed about what Jeremy Hunt didn't provide. So, you know, a bit more on electric vehicles, much more emphasis on getting our housing stock right. And also, you know, another thing that's come up recently is more of a plan around the industrial transition. We were disappointed that workers weren't consulted, and I think as a consequence, we ended up with a plan for Port Talbot Steelworks that involved losing a lot of jobs. There were some good aspects of that, but the opportunity to go down the producing genuinely green steel seems to us to have been lost, and we'll end up importing our steel production effectively, and that doesn't seem to us smart or clever. And we could have contributed to the global green transition, as well as securing those jobs, as well as securing virgin steel production, which certain sectors need. So there's a range of things where I think we could see more investment. And actually, you know, when you look at those carbon targets coming ever closer, and you see the climate impacts taking off around the world, and knowing it's only going to get worse, there's absolutely no time to waste here.
Better infrastructure is essential then, but other obstacles to the green transition remain. In particular, Clarkson pointed to a number of hard-to-abate sectors.
A few years ago, we always talked about the hard to abate sectors was kind of the phrase, which kind of meant we don't really know what to do about these ones. And you used to hear a lot more. So you'd hear about hard to abate, and I used to hear a lot more arguments about well, why would you do, electric vehicles if you can't do renewable energy? I think what's changed is a kind of a much better understanding that net zero is everything. Like these choices are not real. We've actually got to do everything. And a lot of work was done on heavy industry, which, as they say, hard to abate. So steel, concrete, plastics, chemicals, things like glass. So all the kind of materials, it's very hard to take the emissions down in those, but also a realization that if we're going to get to net zero, we're going to have to decarbonize those sectors. And the way that you decarbonize them by 2050 is to start the work now. So we launched 2 campaigns in the last few years, Concrete Zero and Steel Zero. And those are commitments to procuring. So it's companies on the demand side of the market, i.e. people who buy steel and concrete, saying, look, by 2050, we want to be procuring zero carbon steel and zero carbon concrete, and we will support the industry in that decarbonisation journey. And what that means is if you're on the supply side of the market, you know that demand is there, and you know that you can start investing in that transition because you're going to have a market for your product when you've done it. So actually 8% of global emissions come from steel, right? So that's a huge chunk of emissions that we need to get out of the market by 2050. We sort of know how to do green steel. That technology is improving, the costs are coming down, but by putting that demand out into the market, we hope we can really accelerate that process.
In its demands, Extinction Rebellion lists Tell the Truth as its first, stating that we must be clear about the extreme cascading risks humanity now faces. Considering obstacles to the green transition, Richard identified disinformation, particularly climate denial, as a particularly damaging hurdle.
I think the real obstacles is that there are a few outlets which are very influential, which are not necessarily representative of what the population needs to hear. I mean, you've only got to open a newspaper, for example, and most newspapers are owned by billionaires who have an agenda. And it seems to us that they are using those newspapers as their own platform, masquerading, if you like, as news. But actually, it's just their own opinions. I mean, I can't help noticing that there has been a really significant uptick in, it used to be what I would call climate denial, whereby these outlets would pump out basically disinformation about the established climate science and the facts of climate change and global warming. But now the tack has changed, and it's more about trying to make the solutions sound unpalatable. Well, I mean, this is absurd. I mean, there's a real campaign against things like low traffic neighborhoods, which, are pretty popular with residents, and I can understand why, against clean air zones, which again, I mean, clean air zones deliver seriously good health outcomes for people who would otherwise be made very ill and are killed by air pollution. And yet, if you open some of the papers, you would think that this was the worst thing that could ever happen, and you've got this current kind of, I don't like using the word culture wars, but I mean, that's what it is, isn't it? It's trying to stoke up division for political or financial benefit. That is an obstacle to change. And that's got to stop. I wish I had a silver bullet to be able to cut through that. I don't. But I do go back to, some of our core demands, which are, we've got to be telling the truth. Everyone should be telling the truth about how dire this emergency is for both us as humanity in terms of what climate breakdown will do to us as humanity, but also to nature. The nature that we all love, is being frankly massacred by our current trajectory. And all the media should be telling the truth. The government should be telling the truth in its in the messaging that it puts out to the population, and businesses should be too. They should be being honest about the impact that their businesses are having on the world that we love. So, yeah, telling the truth has got to be a way of breaking through, overcoming the obstacles which I described earlier. And of course, we've got to act now. We have to act now. This situation is so dire, and we are. Some people say we are out of time already. I don't believe that we're out of time. Every fraction of a degree of global heating that we can prevent will have benefits.
Nuclear power has been touted as a potential solution to the energy transition. It currently accounts for around 10% of electricity globally, a figure that the IEA reports rises to almost 20% in advanced economies. Clarkson believes that nuclear is likely to be part of the mix.
So, yeah, the first thing I want to make a distinction between clean and zero carbon. So, it's an important source of low carbon power. When you've got nuclear, so if you've got nuclear running, it is zero carbon at that point. It's incredibly carbon intense to build, and it's also really incredibly difficult to clean up. And the what we call old nuclear, so the form of nuclear we have now. So I would never describe it as a clean energy source, but it has had a big role in reducing emissions in the last 30 to 40 years where there is nuclear in the world. So I think it's clear that in many parts of the world, nuclear is going to be part of the energy mix in 2050, and it's going to be an important kind of low carbon part of the energy mix. But we can't wait for new nuclear to come online. We've got to be really, really scaling up renewables. And so nuclear, we see it in the UK, people who are in the UK will know this, it always takes longer to build than it's said. It always goes over budget. Think of every news story we hear about nuclear at the moment. And that's not just the UK, globally, nuclear takes longer to build and goes over budget. And so we've got to prioritize renewable energy and maximize renewable energy. Energy demand is going to go up as well between now and 2050. So we've got to get as much of that done. It's significantly cheaper. You can get it built so quickly. So I talked about wind earlier. Solar's even quicker. And that is going to be the primary pathway for getting to net zero by 2050, is going to be from huge use of renewables and electrification. So I think nuclear will be in the mix, but I think what's a mistake is an approach which is like, we'll just wait for nuclear in 15 years' time. We've got to get all the emissions we can out of the economy between now and then.
For Parr, however, the UK's interest in nuclear power has become a distraction from efforts to improve renewables infrastructure.
Nuclear power can't bridge the gap between anything and anything. It is too slow. It is too expensive. It is a massive distraction. It doesn't help with the kind of grid system that we need, which is going to be renewables heavy. And I think the UK focus on nuclear power is now an obstacle to delivering net zero. It's an obstacle because it's sucking up time, energy, and political bandwidth, which can be spent on more useful things. So if we weren't seemingly looking to throw increasing amounts of money towards Sizewell C, which is a nuclear power station that hasn't yet got the go-ahead, but government shows every sign of wanting to get it to go ahead, that's a lot of money that we could be spending on things that will be delivering this decade rather than towards the end of the 2030s, which is when it would actually get to be online. The argument that is made by the nuclear power advocates that it's there when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, yes, that's true, but that's not the only way to deal with those situations. There are, firstly, a diversity of renewables that, like geothermal, hydro, and even tidal, which might be helpful at that time. But recognizing that our systems are going to be wind and solar heavy, then we need forms of storage. And the innovation that is going on around storage is going at absolutely madcap pace. So we're not talking about lithium-ion batteries here. We're talking about hot bricks. We're talking about green hydrogen. We're talking about expanded hydro and pumped hydro. There's a lot going on in this space. Liquid air is another one that's a very good little company, little company at the moment that's already got contracts for storage in California and so on. This field is going to change radically, and we'll be putting a load of money into something like Sizewell C when actually we'll find it's a white elephant by the time it's opened. And we'll have spent all that time and energy and effort on things that could have been put into, improving our housing stock, or improving our grid, or improving the ability of electric vehicles to meet all the needs of people through a proper charging network. Things that would deliver this decade, not in 15 years' time. So we'd cut a lot more carbon. We'd get something done that's useful, and we wouldn't have piles of messy radioactive waste that we still don't know what to do with at the end of the time.
Looking to the future, Extinction Rebellion's Ecclestone believes there is cause for optimism.
There are glimmers of optimism out there. I think when people come together, particularly when communities at local level come together and want to do something, it just shows the power of cooperation, collaboration, and making things happen at various levels. And I'm sure that can, if you like, filter upwards, and we can get the same kind of mutual understanding and a kind of a respect for each other, a respect for, this beautiful planet upon which we live and upon which we depend. A kind of recognition that really the time has come to hold that sacred, to look after it.
The climate group's Clarkson has a more tempered view, but also seems to remain hopeful.
I think it's incredibly challenging. I think it's really hard to look at the news and look at that and go, tons of optimism there. It's getting more and more difficult. I think that the climate is reacting to the carbon that's already there, and emissions aren't yet moving in the right direction. We have had reduced emissions, but that was much more linked to COVID, really. So, but there are things that can make you see that there is kind of hope out there. And I think one of the things that's interesting is some of the shifts that we've seen in Asia. So a lot of the Asian economies are, above the global average on renewable electricity. I was reading some stats about. So I think the global average is about 12% installed renewables. China's at 14%, Vietnam's at around 19%. So a lot of the export economies in Asia, because of the pressure that's coming onto them, things like the climate group's RE100 campaign, which is global companies committed to renewable electricity, they then pass that down the supply chain and say, hey, you need to supply us products that are made with renewable electricity. Things like that, things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, which is a way of saying, again, to Asia, look, you've got to account for their carbon in the stuff that you're selling. Well, that's driving huge change in Asian economies. So it's not like they've got some sort of moral high ground that they're taking in all this renewables. It's an economic decision, and that is driving change quite quickly. And when you look what's happening in China and the speed at which China is deploying renewables, that does suggest to me that if you kind of trace it all back kind of to Paris and the world basically agreeing that we need to tackle this, you can then start to see the change play out. I think where we are now, it is a kind of race between the way the climate is already reacting to the amount of accumulated emissions and the speed at which we can deploy technologies and, as I said, get all the kind of regulations and things in place to tackle it. But it's in humanity's interest to tackle this, and so I hope that we will.
And Parr from Greenpeace remains positive, but believes there is a pressing need for governments to focus on climate change.
I feel optimistic that we are moving forward. The day job feels like bashing my head against a brick wall quite a lot of the time. But actually, if you look out over time, you can see the transformations that have taken place, that electric vehicles are now far, far outselling diesel vehicles, that offshore wind, when I first started campaigning on it 20 years ago, people thought it was a bit mad. And now it's a major industry. It's going to be the backbone of the UK's energy system. It's becoming a global industry with the US, Taiwan, China, Australia, Japan, as well as continental Europe, all coming to the party and wanting a slice of the action. So, you can see change happen if you just sort of draw back a bit. And I'm very optimistic about that. I think that's going to carry on. I think what give me sleepless nights is that too often we have a political system that will mouth the right platitudes around climate change, but when things get slightly tough, they'll run away. there's no real depth of certainty and conviction around making stuff happen, when sometimes it does need political leadership. It does need something to happen from the top to make it work. I mean, I've outlined how renewables are now cheaper and there are ways of accommodating the variability of wind and solar, but you need to build the grid system to make that work, and that takes a level of political leadership that can't come from an individual solar farm developer. It needs a guiding hand to make that work together. And it's, as I say, it's all too easy to run away, and that's what I worry about.
Thanks to Doug Parr from Greenpeace, Helen Clarkson from the Climate Group, and Richard Ecclestone from Extinction Rebellion for their insights into the UK's green spending, the obstacles facing the energy transition, and the priorities for investment moving forward. Thanks to you all for listening. That's all we've got time for today. So from us in Thematic Intelligence, see you next time.